From the earliest moments of consciousness, humankind has been haunted and perhaps comforted by a singular eternal question. What happens after we die? This inquiry is not merely the curiosity of philosophers or the domain of religious mystics. It is a question that lives within each of us, one that grows louder in moments of grief, silence, and solitude. Do those we have loved and lost continue to exist in some form? More specifically, do they still see us, know us, care about the lives we continue to live? To ask whether the dead watch the living is to ask about the very structure of reality, about consciousness, about love, and about whether death is an end or merely a transition. For me, this question was no longer theoretical when I lost my grandmother. In the weeks after her passing, I experienced what many would call coincidences, her favorite song playing at the most unexpected moments, dreams where she appeared not as a memory but as a presence, whispering messages I could never quite forget. I felt her during key decisions, moments of hesitation, even times of celebration. Was this simply grief manifesting in psychological echoes, or was it evidence of something far more mysterious? I began asking others. What I discovered was a tapestry of shared experience, subtle but striking moments that people often keep to themselves out of fear of ridicule. One friend recounted avoiding a major accident after hearing her late father's voice in her head. Another discovered a vital family document lost for years, on the exact anniversary of his mother's death, in a drawer he had checked dozens of times before. None of these stories on their own offer definitive proof. The scientific community, rooted in empiricism, tends to interpret such experiences as products of grief, cognitive patterning, or wishful thinking. Psychologists describe these moments as natural extensions of the mourning process, our brain's effort to preserve emotional connection and create closure. And yet, across cultures, across centuries, and across belief systems, we find recurring themes. The dead, it seems, are never truly gone. In nearly every ancient civilization, from the pyramids of Egypt to the ancestral altars of China, we see traditions that assume a continued relationship between the living and the departed. These aren't primitive misunderstandings, but rather sophisticated spiritual frameworks passed down through generations. Egyptians left food and tools in tombs, believing their loved ones needed sustenance in the afterlife. Chinese families still burn paper offerings, convinced that money and goods can be transferred into the spirit world. What are these rituals if not expressions of an enduring relationship, a belief that death is not a door that closes but a veil that thins in moments of love, grief, or spiritual openness? As I delved deeper into this question, I found myself captivated by the life and work of Edgar Cayce, often referred to as the sleeping prophet. A modest man from Kentucky, Cayce would enter a self-induced trance and deliver remarkably detailed readings on medicine, spirituality, and most fascinatingly, the afterlife. What made his work so compelling wasn't just its depth, but its synthesis of Eastern metaphysics and Western theology. In Cayce's view, consciousness did not perish, it migrated. And those who had passed retained awareness, but not in a way that resembled earthly surveillance. Instead, through vibrational bonds of emotion and soul recognition. This idea that love is the bridge between realms kept surfacing in both anecdote and doctrine. And so I set out not to prove anything but to understand, to gather accounts, study traditions, consult scientific findings, and above all, Listen to the stories of those who have stood at the threshold between life and death and returned changed. In the parts that follow, I will explore personal experiences that defy conventional explanation, scientific research on near-death experiences and consciousness, ancient rituals that still shape our relationship with the deceased, philosophical and quantum theories that may bridge the gap between this world and the next. But before we venture further, let us ask not simply, do the dead watch us? Instead, let us open to a larger, more transformative possibility, that death is not an end, but a change in perception. That the living and the dead are not separated by distance, but by dimension. That through the force of love, memory, and consciousness, the ones we miss may never be far. The further I journeyed into this inquiry, the more I began to see that the boundary between life and death is not a wall, but a veil. One that may grow thin in moments of intense emotion, deep stillness, or spiritual readiness. When my grandmother passed, I questioned whether the strange signs I experienced were genuine or simply grief expressing itself through dreams and synchronicity. But as I began to speak with others, people of different ages, cultures, and beliefs, I realized how widespread and profound these experiences truly are. One friend told me of a moment on the highway just days after her father died. A voice, clear and firm, told her to slow down. She obeyed instinctively, only to avoid a catastrophic pile-up seconds later. "It wasn't my thought," she said. "It was his voice. I know it was him." Another described stumbling upon a crucial legal document in a drawer she had searched countless times. She found it, unexplainably, on the exact date of her mother's death. She always took care of the details, she told me. I felt like she helped me one last time. These stories do not emerge from people seeking attention. In fact, most remain quiet, reluctant to be judged. But the common thread of presence, reassurance, and meaningful coincidence suggests something more than fantasy. Still, we must acknowledge the skepticism. Psychology tells us that during grief, our minds naturally reach for connection. Dreams of the departed may be our subconscious helping us cope. Patterns, coincidences, and even scents associated with lost loved ones can arise from deep emotional imprinting. The science is not wrong, but perhaps it is incomplete. While mainstream science often dismisses these encounters as wishful projections, the human experience tells a more complicated story. Across religious traditions, we find remarkably consistent beliefs that death is not the end, and that the bond between the living and the dead endures. In Catholicism, prayers for the dead are said to aid their souls in purgatory, guiding them toward peace. In Buddhism, rituals are conducted to help the soul transition through various stages of the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. In Judaism, the Kaddish is recited in memory of the deceased, affirming life while acknowledging the soul's journey. What do all these practices have in common? They point to a relationship that does not end with the final breath. They suggest a world in which love, remembrance, and consciousness continue to echo between realms. What makes this question so profound? Do the dead watch the living? Is not merely its mystical nature, it is what it reveals about us. We fear abandonment. We long for reassurance. We crave to know that our grief has somewhere to go, that our love is still received. And beyond fear, there is hope. The hope that those we've loved continue in some way to see our lives unfold. that our joys are shared, our struggles witnessed, our choices acknowledged. Some believe this possibility instills not just comfort but also a deeper sense of accountability. If we are seen, if our actions matter not just to ourselves but to those who have passed, perhaps we live more deliberately, more compassionately, more aligned with who we are meant to become. As my research deepened, I became drawn to the idea of a middle path, one that respects scientific rigor but remains open to the mysteries that empirical instruments cannot yet measure. Perhaps the truth lies not in extreme skepticism, nor in uncritical acceptance, but somewhere in between. A place where the border between life and death is not absolute, but porous, where our loved ones are not omnipresent observers but occasional visitors, drawn not by routine but by resonance. This idea, echoed in both ancient lore and modern metaphysical thought, led me to investigate how different cultures have viewed this connection across time. And what I discovered was nothing short of astonishing. Ancient Egypt, for example, viewed death as a transition into a parallel world. The elaborate tombs, the Book of the Dead, and the ritual offerings were not mere superstition. They were expressions of a belief that the dead needed guidance, sustenance, and acknowledgement. In China, the tradition of ancestor veneration remains strong to this day. Families burn hell money and paper replicas of items the deceased may need, cars, houses, even smartphones, believing these offerings will serve their loved ones in the spirit world. These aren't just symbolic acts. They're statements of a living connection, a belief that the dead remain with us, not as shadows or ghosts, but as participants in our story from another dimension of reality. And yet, the modern Western world has largely abandoned this view. With the rise of materialism and empirical science, death has become a clinical event, a moment after which nothing is assumed to remain. But even in the most skeptical corners of science, cracks have begun to form in that worldview. And so I turn to those cracks, to the researchers, doctors, and scientists who dared to ask a different question. What if consciousness doesn't end with the body? In Part 3, we'll journey into the world of near-death experiences, deathbed visions, and groundbreaking scientific studies that challenge our assumptions about what it means to be alive and what may await us when we are no longer. The moment I began exploring the scientific literature on consciousness and near-death experiences, the tone of my journey shifted. What had begun as a philosophical and spiritual inquiry began to intersect with documented cases, clinical studies, and observations from people on the front lines of life and death. Doctors, nurses, and patients themselves. One of the most important names I encountered was Dr. Raymond Moody, a physician and philosopher who, in 1975, introduced the world to a term that has since become part of our cultural lexicon: near-death experience, or NDE. Dr. Moody compiled over 1,000 case studies from individuals who had been clinically dead, some for minutes, before being resuscitated. Their testimonies were astonishingly similar. The sensation of floating above the body, watching as medical staff worked frantically to revive them, being drawn toward a tunnel or radiant light, and most remarkably encountering deceased relatives or spiritual beings who communicated not with words, but with profound understanding. Critics dismissed these accounts as the result of brain chemistry, oxygen deprivation, or hallucination. And yet these explanations often fail to account for the consistency of the experiences across age groups, cultures, and belief systems. Even more compelling were the verified cases in which individuals described things they could not have seen, events in other rooms, details of medical procedures and conversations that occurred while they were clinically brain dead. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, another pioneering voice in this field, worked for decades with terminally ill patients. In her work, she repeatedly encountered stories of what she called deathbed visions, moments, hours, or even days before death when patients would describe being visited by deceased loved ones. These weren't vague dreams. They were vivid, coherent, and often profoundly comforting. She observed children who, without any theological background, would speak calmly of being met by grandparents or angels. She watched adults light up with joy as they described the presence of someone who had died years before, just before they too passed away. To some, these may be seen as internal projections, a psychological balm for the dying mind. But for those who witnessed them, including experienced hospice workers, the feeling was very different. I spoke with Maria, a hospice nurse with over 30 years of bedside experience. I've seen patients who hadn't spoken in days suddenly become lucid. They talk to someone we can't see, and it's not confusion, it's clarity, it's peace. She told me of a man who hadn't opened his eyes in nearly a week, suddenly raising his hand toward the ceiling and whispering, "Mom, you're here." He died moments later, smiling. Stories like these abound in hospice literature and among those who work with the dying. They paint a picture of death not as a void, but as a transition, a crossing into another reality that sometimes overlaps ever so briefly with our own. And then there are the more deliberate, studied attempts to understand after-death communication, or ADCS, using scientific methods. Dr. Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Research Center has conducted tightly controlled experiments with mediums, individuals who claim to receive messages from the deceased, in blind studies where neither the medium nor the sitter had any prior knowledge of each other. The results were statistically significant. The information given, names, relationships, causes of death, personal memories, could not be explained by chance. Is this proof? Not in the strictest scientific sense, but it is evidence, cumulative, consistent, and impossible to ignore. What emerged from all these accounts was a clear pattern. When the dead reach out, if they do, it is rarely to comment on our daily routines. They do not appear to scold or surveil. Rather, their presence tends to emerge in moments of deep need or great love. A wedding day, the birth of a child, a night of unbearable grief, a crossroads of choice. Their communications through dreams, symbols, synchronicities, or sensations are often subtle but emotionally powerful. They offer reassurance, encouragement, a quiet sense that we are not alone. And this, perhaps, is the most significant discovery of all. The dead do not watch us in the way we might watch television. It is not surveillance. It is something more refined, more sacred, a resonance of consciousness, a knowing that transcends space and time, activated not by attention but by emotional connection. This idea is echoed in the work of Edgar Cayce, who often described the afterlife as a realm of vibration, not out there, but interwoven with our own world, just vibrating at a different frequency. He spoke of souls existing on multiple planes simultaneously, where awareness is drawn to loved ones through shared spiritual bonds, not constant visual observation. And remarkably, modern science may be beginning to catch up with this metaphysical model. Quantum physics has long challenged our assumptions about reality. The principle of non-locality suggests that two particles once connected remain entangled, able to influence each other instantaneously, even when separated by vast distances. If matter can remain connected beyond time and space, why not consciousness? Might our emotional bonds, our memories, and our love act as quantum threads, linking us across realms? In Part 4, we will explore this possibility further. We'll look at indigenous beliefs, religious rituals, and quantum theories that suggest something astonishing: that the connection between the living and the dead may not just persist, it may be fundamental to the very nature of existence. As I continued my exploration, I began to realize that this question, whether the dead are aware of the living, was not isolated to modern Western thought. It is a question that spans continents, civilizations, and epochs. In nearly every corner of the world, from the most ancient cultures to the most isolated tribes, there exists some belief, explicit or implied, that the dead remain connected to the living. In the indigenous Maori tradition of New Zealand, for instance, ancestors are not merely remembered, they are revered as active guardians. During rituals, prayers, and significant life events, the presence of ancestral spirits is invoked as a source of guidance and protection. These aren't symbolic gestures, they are lived realities for those who carry the weight and wisdom of ancestral lineage. Similarly, in Mexican culture, Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, is not a mournful remembrance but a celebratory reunion. Families create altars adorned with photographs, favorite foods, and offerings for their deceased loved ones. It is believed that during this time the boundary between worlds softens and the spirits of the departed return, not as passive onlookers but as cherished guests. Even in Islamic teachings, the soul enters a phase known as barzakh, an intermediate realm between this world and the afterlife. While the soul's primary concern becomes spiritual progression, many traditions maintain that it retains a limited awareness of earthly affairs, particularly when the living engage in prayer or acts of charity on the departed's behalf. In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo Thodol, popularly known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, outlines in detail the journey of consciousness after death. It describes a 49-day transitional state in which the soul encounters both visions and opportunities for liberation. During this time, the consciousness is still sensitive to the grief of its loved ones and is encouraged to release earthly attachments to proceed forward. Here we find a striking insight. In many traditions, the awareness of the dead is neither constant nor voyeuristic. Rather, it is selective, emotional, and purposeful. They are drawn not to our routines but to our emotional states, especially when we call upon them through grief, remembrance, or ritual. To understand this dynamic further, I interviewed Dr. Samantha Fletcher, a grief counselor with over 2 decades of experience working with clients who report after-death communication. What fascinates me, she told me, is how consistent these reports are. They rarely involve visual apparitions or ghostly encounters. Instead, people speak of symbols, sensations, and perfectly timed synchronicities. A song, a scent, a sudden memory that arrives with emotional force. She explained that these experiences tend to occur during liminal states, the moments between sleep and waking in deep meditation or during times of emotional vulnerability. It's not constant, she said. It's not casual, it's meaningful, it's intelligent. And above all, it's loving. That word again, love. It continues to appear in every account, whether anecdotal or sacred, scientific or spiritual. And it was in one of these stories that I saw love made manifest in a way that no theory could dismiss. James, a decorated combat veteran, had lost his best friend in Afghanistan. Years later, during a dark night of despair, he found himself on the verge of suicide. In that moment, he felt a sudden and overwhelming pressure on his shoulder. The exact gesture his friend used to give him when words weren't enough. "It stopped me cold," he said, holding back tears. "I knew it was him. No one could ever touch me that way. No one else knew that gesture. It wasn't just memory, it was presence." And so we begin to understand that if the dead do watch the living, it is not in the way we watch a movie. It is more akin to a tuning fork that resonates when struck with the right frequency. That frequency is emotional significance, love, sorrow, celebration, transformation. Even modern physics lends a voice to this possibility. The late physicist David Bohm proposed the concept of the implicate order, a hidden layer of reality where everything is enfolded into everything else. In this model, consciousness does not emerge from the brain but flows through it, much like radio waves through a receiver. Death, then, might be a shifting of the dial, a transition to another station, not a cessation of the signal. Likewise, the idea of non-local consciousness, championed by researchers such as Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, suggests that awareness is not bound by the brain but exists as a field of information that interfaces with the body, much like the internet interfaces with your device. If this is true, then when the body dies, the field of consciousness continues. This theory could explain the astonishing accuracy of information received by people who have never met the deceased, as well as the unshakable feeling of presence reported by the grieving. And here's the deeper implication. If love is a vibrational force, then it may act like gravity across dimensions, pulling together those whose hearts remain intertwined, no matter the state of their physical form. In the next part, we will explore one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in this field: children who remember past lives. What can they teach us about consciousness, death, and the possibility that we never truly say goodbye? As my investigation deepened, I came upon what many consider the most astonishing evidence suggesting that consciousness survives physical death. Young children who remember past lives. This phenomenon has been rigorously studied for decades by a small but dedicated group of researchers, most notably Dr. Ian Stevenson and his successor, Dr. Jim Tucker, at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. Their work spans over 2,500 documented cases collected from countries all over the world. In these cases, children, typically between the ages of 2 and 7, report memories of previous lives with uncanny detail. They speak of names, places, occupations, family members, and even how they died. In many cases, their statements are so specific that researchers have been able to verify the existence of the people they claim to have been. People the children had no natural way of knowing about. What makes these cases especially compelling is the verifiability of the information. Children have described obscure historical details, exact family relationships, or hidden personal items belonging to deceased individuals, facts that even the current family of the deceased did not know until investigated. One particularly striking case involved a young boy in India who remembered being a man from another village. He recounted the man's full name, the names of his children, the details of his shop, and how he died from a head injury. When researchers visited the location the boy described, they found that every detail matched a man who had died years earlier. The family of the deceased man was stunned. The boy even recognized people and personal objects without any prior exposure. Skeptics might attribute such stories to parental influence, fantasy, or coincidence. But in many of the best documented cases, the families had no knowledge of the person their child claimed to be. In fact, many families were deeply religious or skeptical themselves and resisted the idea of reincarnation, making the accounts all the more striking. Dr. Tucker has found that in many of these children, the memories fade as they grow older, as if the veil between lifetimes thickens with age and social conditioning. Yet during those early years, the clarity of memory and the emotional charge attached to them is profound. These stories challenge not just our understanding of life after death, but our very definition of identity. If a child can carry memories, fears, or even physical marks associated with a previous life, what does that say about the continuity of consciousness? About the soul? I spoke with Elizabeth, a mother in the American Midwest whose 4-year-old son began speaking about Grandpa's red tractor and the time he lost fingers in the accident. The boy had never met his grandfather, who died before he was born. The stories he told were never discussed in the household. Yet the details were exact, including the fact that the man had lost 2 fingers in a farming accident, something even Elizabeth had almost forgotten. When I asked him how he knew, she told me, he looked at me as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He said, "Grandpa told me when I was sleeping." This wasn't imagination. It was connection, beyond time, beyond logic, beyond any conventional explanation. Such cases invite us to consider the possibility that relationships transcend lifetimes, that bonds of love and learning persist through the shifting currents of incarnation, that perhaps when we meet certain people, we aren't meeting them for the first time, but recognizing them. And this brings us full circle, because whether we are speaking of after-death communication, near-death experiences, or past life memories, a consistent theme arises. Continuity. Continuity of consciousness, continuity of love, continuity of connection. These stories and the research surrounding them align uncannily with the teachings of Edgar Cayce, whose insights first inspired my journey. Cayce described the afterlife not as a static place, but as a series of vibrational dimensions through which the soul travels in its evolution. In his view, consciousness does not originate in the brain, but flows through it, just as light passes through a lens. When the lens breaks, the light continues. He believed that the dead remain aware of the living not through visual observation, but through emotional resonance and soul-level awareness. They do not watch us in the way we often imagine, but they respond to our energy, our memories, and our love, just as we are drawn to theirs. This perspective is more than comforting, it is empowering. If true, it means we are never truly alone. The relationships that shape our lives do not end with death. They transform, continuing in subtler, more profound ways. As the evidence gathered from science, spirituality, and personal experience continued to converge, I found myself arriving at a deeper and more meaningful question, one that transcended curiosity or even comfort. The question was no longer simply, Do the dead watch us? It had become. If they do, how should we live differently because of it? What if the choices we make, the energy we carry, and the love we give are witnessed not only by those around us but by those we've lost? What if our lives echo across dimensions, touching souls who have passed from the physical world but remain connected to us through unseen threads? This possibility introduces a kind of spiritual accountability, not based on fear or judgment, but on love and legacy. If the people who shaped us, who sacrificed for us, who loved us unconditionally, if they still see us in some form, does that not invite us to live more authentically, more courageously, more compassionately? I began contemplating how this idea could alter our very sense of purpose. When we believe death is the end, we often treat life like a race to avoid it. But when we understand death as a transformation, life becomes part of something far larger, far richer, a journey of the soul through phases, each with its own lessons and responsibilities. This shift in perspective is not just theoretical. It can be felt viscerally in those liminal spaces where the veil between worlds thins. I spent time at a secluded monastery in the mountains, speaking with monks who had practiced ancient meditations on death and the continuity of the soul. One monk, Brother Michael, had lived in silence and contemplation for over 40 years. When I asked him what he believed about the dead watching the living, he simply smiled. "That question assumes separation," he said softly. "But separation is an illusion. When you understand that consciousness is one field, one ocean, then the waves are never truly apart. They rise, they fall, they merge, but they remain water. They remain connected." This poetic answer, rooted in decades of disciplined introspection, reminded me of the quantum principle of entanglement. The idea that once two particles interact, they remain connected no matter how far apart they travel. A change in one instantly affects the other. What if consciousness, like light, like gravity, is non-local? What if love itself is the tether between souls, maintaining resonance beyond time and space? From the lens of quantum metaphysics, this is not far-fetched. Theoretical physicists like David Bohm and Nassim Haramein have proposed that consciousness may be embedded in the very fabric of the universe, more fundamental than matter itself. From this perspective, death is not the breaking of a connection, but a change in form, a transition of awareness from one frequency to another. I encountered further evidence of this in the research of Dr. Helen Wambach, who conducted past life regression sessions with over 1,000 subjects. Her findings revealed not only detailed recollections of previous lives, but also a surprising consistency in what people reported about the space between lives. According to these accounts, souls exist in groups, clusters of consciousness, that reincarnate together in various roles, learning, evolving, and deepening their bonds across multiple lifetimes. These soul groups are not random. They reflect the deeper intelligence of connection, love, and unfinished purpose. This concept explains why some relationships in this life feel strangely familiar, why certain people, even strangers, touch our souls instantly. If the dead do watch the living, perhaps it is not as distant observers, but as fellow travelers, still invested in our growth, still connected through shared missions and soul contracts. These ideas began to change the way I approached grief itself. I no longer viewed grief as something to get over, but rather as a form of love with nowhere to go. A living connection still pulsing even after death. When we grieve consciously, when we speak to our loved ones, honor their memory, or continue their values, we are engaging in a dialogue across dimensions, even if we cannot always hear the reply. And sometimes the replies do come in the phenomenon known as terminal lucidity. Individuals with advanced dementia, brain injury, or nonverbal conditions sometimes experience a sudden return of clarity in the hours before death. They recognize loved ones. They offer words of closure. They express peace. These moments often feel miraculous, and they defy conventional neurology. One such case involved a woman who had been unresponsive for years. On the day she died, she sat up, looked around the room, and addressed each of her family members by name. She laughed, she cried, she gave a message to each person present. And then she lay down and passed away peacefully. What can explain this? By the time I reached this stage in my journey, something profound had shifted. Not only in how I thought about death, but in how I experienced life. What began as a question, "Do the dead watch the living?" had grown into a far-reaching exploration of consciousness, connection, and the continuity of love. And now, it raised yet another question. Are we on the verge of a new understanding of reality itself? For centuries, the scientific and spiritual worldviews seemed irreconcilable, one focused on material proof and empirical data, the other on intuition, inner knowing, and sacred wisdom. But as we move further into the 21st century, these domains are beginning to converge in ways few could have anticipated. The new frontier of consciousness studies is rapidly expanding. Once fringe ideas, such as non-local consciousness, reincarnation, and interdimensional awareness, are now entering serious academic inquiry. Institutions once skeptical of anything beyond the measurable are beginning to reevaluate the limitations of traditional models. Why? Because the evidence is growing too strong and too consistent to ignore. From near-death experiences and past life memories to after-death communication and deathbed visions, we now have thousands of well-documented cases from credible sources. And while each story may be anecdotal, the patterns they reveal paint a cohesive picture. That consciousness continues, and with it a capacity to remain connected. Even more intriguing are the reports of shared death experiences, in which healthy individuals at the bedside of a dying person momentarily experience what their loved one does. These individuals report seeing light, feeling expansion, or even perceiving the soul's release. They describe a sense of peace and unity so profound that it transforms their understanding of death forever. If we accept even a fraction of these accounts as genuine, we are forced to reconsider many of our core assumptions. That the brain is the source of consciousness, that death is the final break in connection, that our loved ones are gone forever. But what if these assumptions were never accurate to begin with? What if, as mystics and sages have long insisted, death is merely a passage into another mode of existence, another vibration of the same field of awareness? This understanding can radically alter how we grieve, how we relate, and how we live. It invites us to treat memory as presence, not absence. To understand that when we speak to the dead, whether through prayer, reflection, or dreams, we are not speaking into a void, but across a bridge. It also challenges us to become more conscious participants in this ongoing relationship. Are we living in a way that continues the values, dreams, and love of those who've passed? Are we listening for the whispers of guidance that come in the quiet moments? Moments we often dismiss as imagination. I spoke with Thomas, a physics professor at a major university who lost his wife unexpectedly. As a man of science, he was reluctant to believe in anything paranormal. But then one night, in a moment of desperation, he asked her for help. Hours later, he found himself compelled to open a drawer he had ignored for years. Inside, he discovered legal documents she had hidden, exactly what he needed to settle her estate. "I don't believe in ghosts," he told me, "but I believe she answered me. I don't know how, but I can't deny what happened. She heard me." Over and over again, I encountered stories like this. Not sensational, not theatrical, but intimate, quiet, and deeply human. They pointed to a form of communication that is subtle but real, invisible but present, like radio waves always there waiting for the right receiver. Perhaps that receiver is the open heart, the still mind, the humble willingness to believe that there is more to existence than what our five senses can register. And here's the most beautiful part. These connections are not one-sided. There is growing belief among spiritual teachers that our love reaches the dead as surely as theirs reaches us. When we honor them, by lighting candles, by telling their stories, by living in accordance with what they taught us, they feel it. Not in the way we feel touch, but in the resonance of consciousness. This transforms remembrance into communion, grief into conversation, death into dialogue. Imagine living each day knowing that your joy may uplift a soul who once cared for you, that your healing helps complete the journey of a departed parent, sibling, friend, that your moments of clarity, compassion, and courage ripple out, not just through time but across dimensions. This is not fantasy, this is a deeper spiritual ecology, a recognition that all life, visible and invisible, is woven together in one great vibrating web of consciousness. And if that is true, then our responsibility is no longer just to live for ourselves. It is to live as part of a continuum of souls, honoring the past, shaping the present, and contributing to a future that includes not just those who will be born, but those who came before. In Part 8, we will arrive at the heart of this mystery. We will explore how death, far from being the final chapter, may be one of the most transformative thresholds of all, and how it calls us not to fear the end, but to live fully now, with presence, with reverence, and with love. As we near the conclusion of this journey, the question that began as a quiet whisper, "Do the dead watch the living?" has unfolded into a much more expansive truth. This question, profound as it is, was never just about observation. It was about connection, about the invisible strands of love and consciousness that weave through time, memory, space, and even death. What I've come to understand is that death, in its truest essence, is not a loss of presence, but a change in form. The people we love do not vanish into silence. They transition into a different way of being, a way that eludes our physical senses but not our inner knowing. They speak not with mouths, but with symbols. They reach not through hands, but through dreams, synchronicities, sensations, and deep, sudden peace. They exist not in the room, but in the moment. That butterfly that lands on your hand during a funeral. The familiar perfume that fills the air with no source. The song that plays at exactly the right moment when you needed a sign. These are not random. They are not tricks of the mind. They are bridges between here and there. I spoke with Jessica, a mother who lost her daughter in a tragic accident. On the first anniversary of her child's death, she visited her grave to plant flowers. As she worked, a single butterfly, her daughter's favorite symbol, landed on her hand and remained for 10 full minutes. It didn't feel like a coincidence, she told me, eyes wet with tears. It felt like her. It felt like love in its purest form, no words, just presence. Stories like these from people across all walks of life affirm what ancient traditions have long taught. The dead are not absent, they are transformed. They do not watch in judgment or in surveillance. They are not ghosts lingering with unfinished business. They are souls continuing their journey, pausing at times to connect, to remind us that we too are eternal. And most often they respond to love. Love seems to be the one force that transcends dimension, that defies entropy, that survives death. It is the gravitational field of the soul, the frequency that links hearts across realms. This aligns with what quantum physics continues to suggest, that consciousness may be the fundamental structure of the universe, and that particles, once connected, remain connected even when separated by time or distance. From this view, consciousness is not confined to biology. It is not a function of neurons. It is something deeper, more primal, something shared. And so when we speak to our loved ones who've passed, when we feel them, remember them, dream of them, we are not imagining connection. We are activating it. This doesn't require belief, it requires presence, a willingness to still the noise and listen with the heart, to trust the subtle, the sacred, the seen only in silence. What does this mean for us, the living? It means that grief need not be a closed door, that remembrance is not nostalgia, it is communion, that healing comes not from forgetting but from deepening the relationship in a new form. It also means that we are called to live with greater care, not out of fear of being watched, but out of reverence for the continuity of relationship. Because every act of kindness we extend, every expression of love, every courageous decision, these ripple not just through the lives of the living, but across the unseen realms where those who love us still walk beside us. This gives our life depth. It gives our pain meaning. It allows our love to continue working long after goodbyes have been said. And what about our own death? Perhaps we need not dread it as a collapse into nothingness, but recognize it as a return to a broader field of being, to a place we've come from, to a home we had only forgotten. In this way, death becomes not the opposite of life, but part of its rhythm, like sleep to waking, like dusk to dawn, a transformation, a passage, a rising. And maybe when our time comes, we too will lean close to those we've left behind. Maybe we'll whisper encouragement in their dreams. Maybe we'll appear as that strange light, that timely wind, that guide and feeling that says, "You are not alone. Keep going. I'm still with you." Because love does not die. It evolves. In Part 9, the final chapter, will bring everything together, science, spirit, and soul, and reflect on how embracing the reality of continued connection can inspire a deeper, richer, and more intentional life today. We began this journey with a single question: do the dead watch the living? And now, after traveling through science, spirituality, ancient traditions, modern experiences, and personal reflections, we find ourselves holding something far more powerful than a simple answer. We hold a new understanding not just of death, but of life. If everything we've explored holds even a measure of truth, then death is not a severing but a transition. not a disappearance but a transformation, not an ending but a change in relationship. The dead do not sit as passive observers hovering silently above us, nor do they haunt our every move, watching like guardians with endless time. Instead, they are present through resonance, called forth by love, by meaning, by emotional significance. They appear in our dreams when we need guidance. They move through synchronicity when we long for reassurance. They reach across the veil in moments of celebration, sorrow, or change, not to interfere but to remind us. You are still loved. You are still seen. You are still connected. This understanding does not negate grief. It dignifies it. It tells us that grief is not the end of love. It is one of its most sacred expressions. It means that mourning is not just about letting go, but about opening up to a new kind of dialogue, one that does not rely on words or logic but on feeling, memory, and heart. And for those who struggle to believe, those who want to believe but fear delusion, let this be said clearly. You do not need to abandon reason to hold reverence. You do not need to discard science to embrace mystery. You simply need to allow for the possibility that consciousness is more than matter, and that love is more than emotion. Love may very well be the architecture of the soul, the field through which connection, memory, and awareness continue beyond the limits of the body. This is not a fantasy. It is a reframing, a broader lens through which we can interpret our most meaningful experiences instead of dismissing them. A way to see the butterfly, the song, the sudden dream, not as coincidences but as echoes of eternity. So how then shall we live? We live as if we are not alone because we aren't. We live as if our choices ripple beyond us because they do. We live as if our love matters more than we know, because it does. Each act of kindness, each moment of presence, each courageous choice, these become part of the unseen tapestry woven with souls past and souls yet to come. In this way, our lives are not isolated chapters but pages in a sacred book that continues beyond the margins of this world. When we begin to live with this awareness, everything changes. Relationships become deeper. Grief becomes sacred. Silence becomes listening. And death becomes not an ending, but a doorway. One we all must walk through, but none of us walk through alone. We may not fully understand what lies beyond that threshold. We may not have maps or certainty, but we do have signs. We do have stories, and most importantly, we have love. And if love is the language of the soul, then even in death, nothing true is ever truly lost. So whether the dead watch us or walk beside us or whisper to us only in dreams, the message is clear. They are still here. And so are we. And together, across realms seen and unseen, we continue.